Have you ever looked at a news headline and seen that the United States is $38 trillion in debt and wondered, who exactly are we writing the check to? Think about it. Every single country on this planet is drowning in red ink. Japan owes $9 trillion. The entire world combined owes an eye-watering $315 trillion. That is 3 times the size of the entire global economy. But here is the paradox that should keep you up at night. If every nation is a debtor, then who is the creditor? If everyone owes money, who is the one collecting? The answer isn't a country, it isn't a king, and it certainly isn't you. When you follow the trail of the money, you don't find a solution, you find a trap. A trap designed by 4 men across 3 centuries who built a world where debt can never, ever be repaid. This isn't a conspiracy theory you find in the dark corners of the internet. This is documented history. The contracts exist. The secret meetings happened. And once you see the blueprint, you realize that $38 trillion isn't a problem to be solved. It is the system working exactly as it was designed to. Before we dive into the architects, I want to ask you a question. Do you feel like your money buys less every year regardless of how hard you work? Keep that feeling in mind as we travel back to the year 1694. Before this date, kings borrowed money like regular people. If a king wanted to fight a war, he went to a merchant, borrowed gold, and promised to pay it back with interest. If he couldn't pay, he defaulted. The lender lost money, the king lost his reputation, and the slate was wiped clean. It was risky, but it was honest. Then came William Patterson. Patterson was a Scottish merchant who had failed at almost everything else in life, but he had one idea that would change civilization forever. England was broke. King William III was fighting France and his treasury was empty. No one would lend him a cent. Patterson approached the king with a deal that sounded like a miracle. He would gather a group of wealthy merchants to lend the government £1.2 million. But here was the catch, the innovation that changed the world. The loan would never be repaid. Instead, the government would pay interest of 8% annually forever. To manage this, Patterson created the Bank of England. The mechanics were a stroke of dark genius. The merchants gave their gold to the bank lent it to the king, and the king taxed the citizens to pay the interest. This made national debt permanent. It turned a problem into a feature. Why did the bankers love this? Because they had essentially bought a subscription to the labor of every English citizen. As long as England existed and could tax its people, the money flowed into the pockets of the bankers. But Patterson's real trick was that the bank was allowed to print paper money backed by that debt. He created money out of thin air based on the king's promise to pay. The more the government borrowed, the more money the bankers could create. This is the foundation of the world you live in today. Government borrows, never pays back the principal, pays interest forever through your taxes, and that debt becomes the very currency in your wallet. By 1790, Alexander Hamilton had already copied this model for the United States. Patterson died in 1719, but his ghost lives in every treasury department on Earth. By the 1800s, this system was working, but it was messy. Each loan was a private deal. That was until Nathan Rothschild arrived. If Patterson built the engine, Rothschild built the factory. The Rothschild family operated a network of banking houses across London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. They could move information and money faster than any government. Nathan Rothschild's greatest contribution to the debt trap was making debt tradable. He didn't just lend money. He turned government debt into bonds and sold them to the public, to insurance companies, and to other banks. He created a web so complex that a default was no longer just a king breaking a promise. If a government refused to pay, the entire international financial network would collapse. He made debt too big to fail before that phrase even existed. Remember the Battle of Waterloo. Legend says Nathan Rothschild learned of Napoleon's defeat a full day before the British government did. He didn't use that info to celebrate, he used it to crash the market. He sold his bonds, making everyone think Britain had lost. When the prices hit rock bottom, he bought everything. When the news of victory arrived, he was the richest man in the world. He proved that if you control the information and the issuance of debt, you own the nations themselves. By 1820, if a government wanted to survive, they had to go through the Rothschilds. They didn't build bridges or factories. They collected interest on the survival of empires. They made the debt trap inescapable. But America was still a wild frontier for bankers. It had no central bank and the public hated the idea of one. Enter J.P. Morgan. In 1907, a massive financial panic hit Wall Street. Banks were failing and the economy was paralyzed. Morgan, already the most powerful banker in America, took charge. He locked the country's top bankers in his private library and told them they weren't leaving until they pledged their money to save the system. It worked, but Morgan knew he wouldn't live forever. He needed a permanent, public version of himself. In 1910, his associates held a secret meeting on Jekyll Island. They dressed as hunters and used fake names so the press wouldn't know the world's most powerful bankers were writing the nation's laws. The result was the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. They didn't call it a central bank because Americans feared that. They called it a system. They made it look like a government agency, but it was designed by bankers for bankers. The Federal Reserve was given the power to create money to buy government bonds. This meant there was now an infinite buyer for debt. The government could borrow as much as it wanted because the Fed would always print the money to buy the bonds. This is why the U.S. debt is $38 trillion today. Without the Fed, the market would have stopped lending to the government years ago. But with the Fed, the party never ends and the bill, plus interest, is sent to you, the taxpayer. J.P. Morgan died the year the Fed was born, but his legacy is the infinite debt machine. Finally, we have the man who made the trap global, Paul Volcker. By the 1970s, the system was straining. Developing nations like Mexico and Brazil had borrowed billions when interest rates were low. When Volcker became Fed chairman in 1979, he raised interest rates to a staggering 20% to stop inflation. This move saved the U.S. dollar, but it crushed the rest of the world. Suddenly, countries that owed billions couldn't even pay the interest. They were headed for default, which would have destroyed the big New York banks that lent them the money. Volcker didn't let the banks fail. Instead, he used the International Monetary Fund to bail out these countries. But these weren't gifts. They were structural adjustment loans. To get the money to keep paying interest to the banks, these countries had to sell off their national resources, cut education spending, and dismantle their economies. Volcker's innovation was simple. Never forgive a debt, just restructure it. Keep the interest flowing at all costs. This turned debt into a tool of political control. If a country wants to participate in the global economy, it must remain in the debt trap. From Greece to Sri Lanka, the script is always the same. So let's look at the final picture. Patterson made debt permanent, Rothschild made it global, Morgan made it infinite, and Volcker made it inescapable. Today, $315 trillion of debt serves as the foundation of our entire world. If the debt was actually paid off, the money in your bank account would literally disappear because every dollar is created as a loan. We are living in a system where we pay rent to exist in the form of interest. Does this explain why you feel like you're running on a treadmill that keeps getting faster? This system wasn't an accident. It was engineered by architects who knew that the best way to own a man isn't through chains, but through a ledger. They built a world where governments are just middlemen who collect taxes from workers to hand them over to bondholders. $38 trillion isn't a crisis. For the people who own the debt, it is the greatest business model ever created. If this changed how you see the world, hit the subscribe button. We go deep into how the machine works because they don't teach this in school. They want you to think debt is a problem you can solve. The architects knew the truth. Debt is the foundation, and interest is the rent we pay for the privilege of living in their world.